Hey everyone, welcome to You Said What, where we look at the most memorable conversations and written interchanges in our lives. First off, I want to thank our sponsor, Pioneering Collective, an executive thought leadership firm combining personal PR, coaching, and networking to transform hard-earned wisdom into heavyweight impact. You can learn more at pioneeringcollective.com. Today's guest is Joel Salinas. Joel is a neurologist, so he's trained as a doctor. But during his training, he had something of an epiphany. He realized that some patients just weren't following his advice. Inspired by a conversation with one of his mentors, he tried something different, and it changed his life. In this episode, Joel also talks about a complex neurologic trait that he himself has called synesthesia, which causes him to constantly perceive each of his senses as a mix with one or more of his other senses. So he actually hears colors and tastes sounds, for example. Hope you enjoy the show. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for the invitation.
I'm going to jump right in here. There's a lot I want to talk about with you. I want to start with your communication moment, the one that really caused you to approach life a little bit differently. It paved the way for your professional future, I think we can say. You're a neurologist, so you went to medical school, and after medical school, you did a fellowship. And the conversation we're going to talk about happened with the fellowship director. Can you tell us about it?
Yeah, so this was at Mass General. I had just finished my neurology residency, and I had started my fellowship now to subspecialize in behavioral neurology and neuropsychiatry. And psychiatry specifically was one of these areas of medicine that I had veered away from early on. I love the brain and kind of everything that has to do with how we feel and think and what makes us who we are. But psychiatry always felt a little kind of nebulous for me, and neurology really felt much more concrete, and which that was one of the reasons why I pursued it as opposed to psychiatry. And once I had done the 4 years of neurological training, I felt like it was a time to really challenge myself again and see how I could tackle kind of psychiatric issues from a neurologic perspective. And one of the things that I learned early on in this experience was I kept on approaching each patient with almost this need to fix the issue that they had going on, no matter what it was, whether it was having issues with tics or kind of tinnitus, like ringing in the ears, or a feeling of having difficulty with thinking or difficulty with memory, whatever it was. I always came at it with the idea, okay, what's the problem? And then what can I prescribe? Like what medication can I give here? Or what kind of diagnostic kind of recommendation can I give, like imaging or blood tests?
This is what medical schools largely teach doctors. If somebody has a problem, how can you fix it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's some of our tools, and the people that are attracted to medicine typically are fixers by nature. Like you see a problem in your reflexes to try to make it better in some way. And I kept on running into the same issue over and over again with these patients, which was that I would try to make a recommendation and it would get shot down, or they'd have a lot of hesitation around it, or they would challenge.
These were behavioral recommendations or drug recommendations, or?
All of the above, all of the above. It was something that I wasn't used to experiencing in a purely neurological kind of context, because these patients had a lot more behavioral and cognitive and psychiatric issues that were going on. And I sat down with my fellowship director. Her name is Zaina Shamali. She's somebody who's boarded in neurology and psychiatry, so she's got the best of both worlds, I think. And I described this to her, and she said, Joel, you're so focused on trying to fix the issue. Have you tried just giving the patient an opportunity to tell you what the issue is and just listen to it without fixing? And that actually was hard for me to wrap my head around, this idea of just listening without fixing. As somebody who leans on the fixer side, it feels like, well, then what's the point? Like, why have them describe all this and me not actually give them some kind of a tool or something to make the situation better? But
she's suggesting that the listening is the fixing?
I think that she was suggesting that at the time that they were different, that they're two different approaches. And I think I didn't really get to appreciate that even though that they were two different approaches, they still helped to lead to a better outcome. Meaning, if I just focused more on being totally present and letting the patient speak and really be not just a good listener, but a great listener, that actually in of itself could be the treatment. Like that was the diagnosis and the therapy in some circumstances. And what I took away from that was really this idea that it's sometimes you don't need to prescribe a medication for a patient to feel better. That can come in so many different ways. And I think one of the ways that it became very clear to me was when I gave patients enough runway to kind of speak. And this is something that is not common in medicine. There's been some research done. This is many years past now, but looking to see how much time passes from the start of a doctor's visit before your doctor interrupts the patient. And that's usually within the first minute, maybe within a few seconds. The doctor will already begin to interrupt the patient. And so my challenge is to try to just let things happen. And what I came to see is that there was almost like, I described it to my fellowship director as like an emotional IND. So IND in medicine stands for incision and drainage. So it's something that you do when there's like somebody has a large kind of abscess or something like that needs to kind of be had some kind of an incision and drained or expressed in some way, which kind of relieves all the bacteria and the kind of like the festering going on there. And that's like a pivotal part of healing something like that. And there were so many patients who really had a lot of pent up kind of emotional, psychosocial, life, work, kind of stress and trauma and all these issues that have been going on. And they just needed an opportunity to have somebody kind of just like poke just a little bit, to ask like the right question at the right time. And then it all just would eventually just come out in this kind of very cathartic experience where the patient becomes very tearful or really very candidly, in a very vulnerable way, begins to share really what's beneath all of these other issues that have been going on in their life, kind of what's really below the surface.
Are you talking about this in a medical realm too, or mainly in a psychiatric realm?
Both, yeah.
So do you find that as a doctor, just listening is sometimes quote unquote cures the problem?
In some circumstances, it actually can cure the problem. It depends. I think curing the problem, to try to get to what's beneath the symptom. This is another part of what we learn in medicine, is that we've got signs, symptoms, and underlying disease or disorder. And symptoms is really what the patient is telling you is the problem. Signs are what you can see or not see. And then the underlying kind of disease or disorder is what's going on beneath the surface, whether it's purely biological or a mix of biology and psychology. I think one example where it can be curative and is actually quite important and blends both neurology and psychiatry is this condition called functional neurologic disorder or functional neurologic disorders. But basically people have kind of neurologic symptoms or kind of changes going on that have an underlying basis in what we call the software of the brain. And it used to be called like a conversion disorder or even way before that, it used to be called kind of hysteria or like a neurasthenia. And the field has evolved a lot, like light years in the last several centuries now. But now in the last decades with functional imaging, we can actually see what's going on in the brain. But basically, these are patients who are really, really distressed about symptoms that can include like a weakness on one side of their body or difficulty with speaking or having episodes that are called like dissociative attacks or dissociative episodes that look like seizures. And they used to be called pseudo seizures because they may convulse and shake and move. But if you had electrodes on their head and you're looking at their brain waves, you don't see what we would see for seizures. And in the medical field, there's a lot of kind of discomfort around managing this kind of a situation because there's that feeling of there's nothing for me to fix. I can't give you like a pill to make seizures go away, for example. This is something that has a firm psychological grounding. And then on the patient side, it's really challenging because they may resist the idea that there's something psychological kind of underlying it, where I think a very common response is, so you're telling me this is all in my head. And so there's this kind of skepticism, this fear of kind of that they're being gaslit, that they have very clear neurological symptom, like weakness, numbness, tremor, you name it. And even though the full evaluation that they've had done doesn't show anything physically abnormal with kind of the structures of the brain or the nervous system, there's still this kind of underlying kind of software issue. But these patients tend to do worse when they encounter doctors who are really resistive, really dodge kind of what's going on, and they end up just seeing multiple doctors. They'll see like dozens of doctors. So it's until you actually do this kind of listening that you can actually guide it.
That's what I was wondering, how it works in practice. If there's a sliding scale here of sort of things that are purely emotional on one end, purely physical on the other end, in terms of what the root cause is, and there's everything in between. So you go in as a doctor or a psychiatrist and you're starting to talk to a patient. And how do you decide if you believe that the treatment could be anywhere on that spectrum? It's much easier in the world of there's these 2 pills I could prescribe, or this, I could give them this wrap to put around their leg. If there's a finite number of solutions, but if there's many more solutions and they're of different types, how do you have a plan of action with that patient?
I think really part of it is the treatment, the diagnosis and the treatment begins the moment you make contact with the patient. How you regard them, what your demeanor is, what your behavior is, how you kind of respect and honor kind of their experience without dismissing them, how empathetic and compassionate you are with them, how present you are as a listener. And I would challenge the notion that that's even only specific to these kind of more psychological or psychiatric types of issues. I think any doctor, anybody that works with clients or people that they care about, kind of approaching somebody sharing what's distressing them with that kind of empathy, that compassion, that patience, and that kind of really being present as a listener where they can feel like you're in it with them has a huge impact on a person's ability to feel a little less alone, to listen to what you might have to say, to be on the same page as somebody else, or even just to become more aware of kind of what's going on underneath the surface. And to give an example of how rare this can actually be, I just met with a medical student yesterday who was interested in working with me in my lab with the research that I do. And one of the things that had stood out to her when we had worked together months before, she said that she had rarely seen a doctor provide care the way that I did. And she gave the example when we were in the emergency room and a woman had come in with something like this kind of functional neurologic disorder. In this case, it was functional blindness, meaning that she was reporting that she couldn't see and there was nothing clearly wrong with the structures of the eyes or the nerves or the brain that would explain it. And there were findings on the exam that pointed towards this functional blindness. And rather than going into it with the perspective of there's nothing wrong or trying to say this is all in your head or there's no pill for you, go home, my first thing I did was pull up a chair in this busy emergency room. Even though it was in the hallway, she was on a stretcher. I pulled up a chair and I sat down. And that's something that you don't often see in the emergency room, is somebody just taking the time, sit down and get at eye level with somebody to just say, with a very open question, can you tell me a little bit about what's been going on?
And what did the patient say? She
started to describe a lot of the distress around the symptoms, because that was kind of what she was anchoring on, that she couldn't see and she doesn't know what's wrong. What am I going to do? She was really anchoring around kind of these, kind of that she has small children and how is she going to provide for them? And she was in this spiral of rumination on kind of how horrible the future was going to be. And to me, when I hear these types of words, it's a manifestation of anxiety that's underneath the surface. And so rather than focusing purely on kind of just the typical questions, the medical questions, I also ask questions like, your vision is so important to you because you want to be able to provide for your family. And then using that as like a launching off point pretty frequently for recommendations. So that way we can make the situation better, or to better understand it, I can have you see a neuro-ophthalmologist who specializes in this. Or we've been taking all of your symptoms very seriously. We're doing the best care that we can for you. And I will walk them through what the evaluation is in the situation. And I would point out, and this is a key thing for these types of patients, is talking about what we call positive signs or positive exam findings. Really not talking about what you don't see, and talking more about what you do see that suggests that this is the issue that's going on. Because then
it's validating the way they're feeling. Yeah.
Exactly. And using language that is more direct. Because I think there's this kind of aversion sometimes there's like a fear of potential conflict or disagreement with the patient that some physicians will have, where they'll use all sorts of language to avoid saying what the diagnosis is. So they'll say things like, we don't see a tumor, or this isn't seizure, and then leave it at that. But for the average person, what does it mean to have a not tumor or a not seizure? That still doesn't explain what the underlying issue is. And so I think being able to actually put words to it and actually provide an opportunity to confront and put it out there and sit with your own discomfort as a physician, that you might not be able to have a medication or a procedure that you can recommend, and knowing that part of the treatment is actually what you're doing in the moment, which is listening.
You do a lot of research into the connection between social interactions and brain health, and specifically the power of having access to a good listener. Talk about some of the findings that you've come up with as a result of that research.
Yeah, the work in our lab has really focused on trying to understand how our social environments, just the world around us and how we relate with other people, influences our brain and our brain health. And one study that we had done recently, we were looking at the brain scans of over 2,300 people who have been followed for many years through this Framingham Heart Study cohort. So it's a population of people that have been followed in the community of Framingham, Massachusetts. And they've had all sorts of tests run for over 70 years, since 1948, across many generations. And the question we came in with was, we talk about things like social connectedness being good for health, but what is it specifically about social connectedness that actually has a concrete kind of benefit for us? And so to dive into this, we were looking at specific measures of social support that can be divided up into different categories. So different types of social support include kind of instrumental support, which is somebody who helps you with like chores, or opening the door, opening a jar. There's informational support. That's somebody giving you information or kind of education or awareness about things that are going on in the world. There's affection or kind of intimate support. That's more kind of a close, kind of intimate companionship. There's emotional support, which is specific to when somebody is experiencing some kind of stressor in their life and having someone who can support them through that. And then there's this other category, which is just called listener availability. Really, the question is, how often do you feel that you have access to someone who can listen to you when you need it? And the response from the person is either none of the time, a little of the time, some of the time, most of the time, or all the time. And we looked at all these different measures in relation to two other kind of key things. One was a person's brain, kind of their physical brain, using MRI scans, and their brain's functioning. And we did that using pretty comprehensive neuropsychological testing, which is really just tests looking at a person's cognitive functioning. And what we found was that very specifically, people who have a listener readily available most or all the time have this phenomenon that we call cognitive resilience. Another term is reserve, but I would say it's cognitive resilience. And what that is kind of like a buffer from changes going on in the brain, whether due to disease or just aging or other stressors. And the way that that represents itself or shows itself up in the data is regardless of what a person's brain volume looks like, regardless of what the size of your brain is or how your brain has aged over time, people who have higher listener availability will still perform just fine on these tests. Meanwhile, people who have low listener availability, it doesn't really matter what's going on with their brain, but in particular when their brain may look like it's aged more, when it has more atrophy or lower volume or more thinning going on with it, they tend to have greater difficulty on cognitive tests. Their brain power is reduced. So in a way, it's providing a buffer from these kind of biological changes. So a person can be functioning day to day just fine, regardless of what's going on physically in their brain. And I think that's fascinating because it can provide just some really powerful insights into the biology of how we can preserve our cognitive function, how we can optimize or maximize our brain power over time or in spite of the world around us or biological changes in our brain. And that it was specific to just having somebody available to listen to you, I think really begins to raise a lot of questions about what is it about listening specifically that it's influencing biology in this way, or what is it specifically about listening that has this really positive effect that we're seeing here?
And that was actually my next question is, do we know biologically what's happening when someone has access to a good listening partner? Like, how does that change the biology or change people's emotions? Do we understand that yet? That's
something that we're still figuring out, but there has been some fair amount of research done looking at the neuroscience of interactions between two people. And there are definitely some differences between kind of a low quality or high quality interaction, where kind of a high quality social interaction is one where you would have kind of this good listener that's available. And so in these types of interactions where there's a good listener available, and it can include components, and this is out of organizational behavior work looking at what constitutes good listening. There's a few pillars to it. One is full attention to the person who you're listening to. So no distractions, that you're very, very focused. Two is demonstrating comprehension of what the person is saying. And that can include things like repeating back maybe not parroting back, but be able to repeat back what they're saying so they know that you are hearing what they're saying, that what they're saying is landing. That can also include asking really poignant questions about what they're saying. Actually, can you say a little bit more about that? Or actually, I don't understand what you mean by that specific word. So it doesn't mean that you're understanding one-to-one exactly what they're saying. It just means that you're actually in that work of comprehension with them. And the third pillar is the assumption of positive intent, meaning that there's this assumption from the person who's being listened to that you mean well to them, that you're not there to listen to kind of then like launch into a persuasive argument or to use what they're saying as a part of like debate or using it against them, or that you're patronizing them. But it's that you're there because you have some kind of positive intent, some kind of kindness toward them. And looking at the actual kind of brain structures that are involved here, from what's been seen in various studies, is the person who's being listened to, you see there's a little bit less of activity in areas that relate to things like pain. This is an anterior cingulate in the insula of the brain, and other kind of what they call like pain matrix areas of the brain, as well as relate to social cognition. And this is kind of more relates to kind of what we know about empathy and compassion, where specifically to empathy, there's these systems in our brain that kind of kick in to really mirror the experience of the people around us in like a simulation. That activity seems to heighten in these kind of much more empathic experiences, especially where you begin to feel that the person who's listening to you is in the same group as you, begin to have some kind of closeness or identity to them. So that's a little bit of what's going on in the brain. I think in general, kind of the biology of what it means to have a good listener can include the biology of reduced stress. It can include an increase in cognitive stimulation, basically just more brain activity in areas that you typically wouldn't have active. There's also likely areas becoming active in the brain that we would see more in a meditative experience. This area called the default mode network is basically kind of the self-reflection kind of system in the brain. There's also this process of attenuation of kind of emotional distress that can happen. So you may have maybe familiar with the phrase "name it to tame it," and this is coming out of a lot of work looking at kind of emotion vocabulary or naming the emotion that somebody's experiencing. And part of the thought behind why this is beneficial is that in naming the emotion that you're feeling, especially the more precise you are in naming the very specific emotion or emotions that you're experiencing, these brain areas that are important for self-regulation and kind of higher order kind of deliberation and judgment begin to come back online. And that also helps to turn the volume down on these emotion, either very negative or very positive or very kind of high alert kind of areas of the brain. So it basically takes the edge off a little bit.
Yeah. You just went through sort of a checklist of great listening, the components of active listening. Which of those are the ones that people usually drop? I think most people know not to interrupt people and basics like that, but you just gave a longer checklist. Which of those do people most often neglect that stops them from being a really good listener?
I think if we were to look at kind of what is often neglected in listening across many people, it would probably be pretty high across all three. And if we were to look at smaller differences between the individual categories, it would probably be at the stage of attention, kind of that earlier stage. Because we often think about paying attention to what somebody is saying or kind of minimizing distractions as what we would idealize in our head as what good listening might look like, which is sitting there, nodding your head, not saying anything. Your brain isn't in a vacuum during that time, and neither should it be in a vacuum at that time. There's all these things going on in your head, which is, what am I going to say next? What do I have going on this afternoon? What did I need to do this morning that I forgot? Oh, this chair that I'm sitting on is uncomfortable. Maybe I should move. Oh my gosh, when are they going to stop talking? And maybe you have a phone in your pocket that even though the ringer is off, it's buzzing in your pocket. You have an Apple Watch and it's like buzzing. All those things are really taking you out of that moment. And actually, people who are being listened to are quite good at noticing when somebody's not paying attention. If you think about the times when you've felt that you had a really great listener and compare it to when you felt like you had a really poor listener, you know the difference. You can tell. They're just so much more engaged in what you're saying, and they're paying attention because they're catching the nuances of what you're saying as well. And this is where like another kind of big insight for me listening came when I was writing my memoir, Mirror Touch, where as I got really down the rabbit hole when it comes to writing and editing, I began to really see parallels between the really great listening and really great editing, which is that you're not just kind of sitting there quietly and kind of agreeing with everything. You're actually highlighting things. You're stopping the person.
You're extracting things that are important that they may not have thought are important.
Exactly. Yeah. Like the interruptions that come in are thoughtful interruptions, and it helps to guide both people into a place where you're learning something new about the person who's speaking, but also about each other. And both of you feel like you're getting something out of the experience.
Right. And it was interesting hearing you talk about your patient-doctor experience where the patient comes in and you're listening to them tell you all the things that they're feeling and experiencing. As you talk about this overlap between journalism and medicine, if that's what you're saying, I've been an editor for a long time, and there's a lot of times where you talk to reporters and they come back with a ton of information. They dump their notebook, as they say in the business. And so they're telling you everything they heard and everything they know. And they're having some trouble sorting out what's important, what's not important, the order that things should go in, what the real storyline, all that stuff. And that's, as you say, that's kind of what editors do, is they listen to what's being presented, like a doctor would listen to what's being presented, and they figure out what do you laser in on, and then how does part A lead to part B, lead to part C. So that resonates with me a lot.
Yeah, there was this moment. I've been watching Inventing Anna on Netflix, and the Shonda Rhimes, Shonda Land team did such a great job with it. And there was this moment. I don't want to like spoil it if you haven't seen it yet, but I'll briefly describe the scene. But basically, there's this moment where kind of the journalist heroine of the story is in the bathroom, and she's just really distressed because she's finished kind of reporting her story, and she's just so tearful and just kind of distressed, and kind of older mentor figure who's been in the journalism field for a very long time comes in after her because he saw that she was really distressed, and she starts to kind of gush about all the things going on, kind of how she feels really guilty or how she felt too close to the subject that she was covering in the story. And he keeps on asking, what's the lead? What's the lead? Like, what's really going on beneath? And she finally gets to this place where she says, I need to now move on to another story. Basically, that the really thing that was causing her all this distress was having to let go of this experience that she had. I think it's actually the editor who said it for her. It was this idea of getting deeper and deeper to like, what's behind this? What's behind that? Until you finally get to this place where you're like, oh yeah, that's the kernel, that's the core that's driving everything else.
Yeah. You've, I think, described yourself as a brain doctor with an unusual brain. And I think in reference to something called synesthesia, which you have, which is a complex neurologic trait that causes people to perceive each sense actually as a blend of senses. So, for example, every time you hear a sound, you smell something specific, or every time you touch a certain fabric, you hear a certain sound, you blend senses. Tell us a little bit about that, explain what that is and what it's like to have that.
Yeah, as you were saying, synesthesia is this kind of blending of the senses. It's something that actually all of us have when we're born, and it lingers until about age 2 years old for most of us, as our brains begin to kind of prune excess connections in a way to make things more efficient in terms of how they run kind of one place to another in the brain, like getting rid of roads to make room for highways. And some people have a tendency to keep those excess connections, or they just have a very kind of chatty brain where these different brain areas tend to talk to each other a lot and connect with each other. And in musicians like Pharrell or Lady Gaga or even Billy Joel, they'll just kind of describe it as, it's called like chromesthesia, like sound color synesthesia, where certain sounds have colors tied to them. A very common form of synesthesia known as kind of grapheme color or kind of letter number color synesthesia means that different letters or numbers have colors associated with them. So
just so I understand, if I am hearing a certain sound, I literally see purple, for example.
Right.
How does it work?
somebody with sound color synesthesia, when they hear kind of a high-pitched dog barking, might experience the color yellow in the shape of like a triangle, or
just be sitting in front of their face, or it would flash in front of them. Or
some people have this thing called, this is fun because we're getting into the weeds here now. So there's projector synesthetes and associator synesthetes. So people who are more of this projector type are people who have a little bit of that sensory experience out in the world around them. Like maybe at the beginning stages of what some people might call like a hallucination or an illusion. And when people are in the associator type, it's purely in the mind's eye, meaning that they can recognize it in their mind, but they don't necessarily have a projection out in the world. So a much more concrete example of that is, for me, one of the forms of synesthesia I have is this grapheme color. And when I see a word, so right now I'm literally looking at the word Friday on my computer, and it's in black font. My brain, kind of the visual areas of my brain, know that is black. My brain calls it black. But there's this additional layer of sensory information that's laid over it. Do you remember the use of transparencies in school, where you would kind of have this plastic, kind of clear plastic sheet that would cover over stuff? So imagine
with colors.
Exactly. So imagine that there's a transparency over it, but with colors. So when I see the word Friday, even though the color of it is all black on the screen, in my brain, there's an added layer where the F is kind of this grayish, silverish color. The R is black. So that feels nice because there's consistency there. The I is kind of like a white, light blue. The D is kind of a darkish brown. The A is red. And the Y is kind of like a lightish yellow. And that's just kind of going on in the background all the time. And
doesn't matter what word you're looking at. It's obviously not triggered by Friday or by black font. It's just that happens. What triggers that?
It's the connections in the brain. There's this part of the brain called the fusiform face area that helps us recognize faces, but it also has been seen in helping to recognize like symbols, and that includes numbers and letters. And there seems to be an increased kind of connectivity and activity between that and parts of our brain that relate to color, to perceiving color. And the way that these connections seem to form, best as can be presumed based off of the research that's available, is that it's like how our brain makes connections as we learn language when we're very young. So like when we're born, our brain is also very, what we call plastic, which basically means that it's got a lot of connections and it's forming and losing lots of connections, which is why we learn so much so quickly. So like language is one of these things where by the time you are at 8 months, you're kind of a universal listener of languages. You can appreciate very small nuances in sound. And there's some really beautiful videos of this online where you can see experimentally. It's also very cute experimentally because it's all like on these little babies. But when we get to about 10 months or so, that kind of window of kind of being the universal listener begins to close, and we begin to lose our ability to listen to more nuanced sound. So an example of that is people who grow up in a Spanish-speaking household have a harder time differentiating between the B as in boy sound and the V as in violin sound. Similarly, if you were not raised in a Hindi-speaking home, you have a harder time differentiating between the hard D sound and a soft D sound. And these kind of connections in the brain that begin to consolidate and kind of become more concrete over time, that parallels these connections in the brain that are happening with different like associations that we have. There's this researcher, David Eagleman, who's a neuroscientist who was looking into synesthesia and surveyed many people with synesthesia, specifically grapheme color synesthesia, and kept kind of a catalog of all of the colors that they associated with their letters and numbers. And as they were looking through the data, they saw an unusual pattern, which is that there seemed to be some letters that were more likely to have a collection of colors. So higher frequency letters, like vowels, were usually lighter, brighter colors. Lower frequency letters typically were, like the letter Z, for example, were darker colors. And that might just have to do with kind of the wiring of the brain. But then there was also a group of people who had a lot of overlap between the colors of their letters. People that kind of grew up in very different kind of states around the US, and their E would be blue, or their B would be orange, and their L would be yellow. And they were trying to figure out, like, why is that? And one thing that they all had in common is that they were all about the same age. And when they took a deeper look, they realized that all of them were about 5 or 6 years old in the early 80s, which is around the same time that Fisher-Price had released a set of colored kind of alphabet magnets for refrigerators. And the colors of those magnets linked very closely with those people's letter color.
So it got imprinted on their brain.
Exactly.
That's so interesting. Back to this Friday example that you were just talking about. So you always see those overlays when you look at font. So when we get off this interview, you're going to look at a screen with some other text on it. Will you always see the same colors and letters together?
Yeah, it's as reliable as a form of synesthesia for me as any. It's an additional layer of information.
But people with synesthesia learn not to get confused by it, right? Like if you hear every time a door slams, you smell cinnamon, for example, you know that the cinnamon's not real, right? Over time, you just learn that that's a distraction.
That's a really interesting question, because there are situations where you can lose track of what is an association and what is out in the actual world. And that might happen like you're really tired or you're really caught off guard. I know this is an experience that I've had where there'll be like a sudden sound in the room and I'll ask, did you hear that? And someone will say, actually, I didn't hear anything, but this light went off with this like fire exit in the corner. And that was the thing. I actually perceived that blink of light as a sudden sound. So these things can kind of get a bit blended. And there's this phenomenon with people who do have this kind of a number color synesthesia or other kind of associations. There's another form. This is like going deeper down. We're really walking down the hole together. The people who have ordinal linguistic personification is basically you have characteristics or personalities linked to numbers. So some numbers will be more feminine or masculine or have certain personality traits. So I'll just give you the example for myself, because this is another form of synesthesia I have. So 2 is not just like a reddish violet kind of colored number, but also has like feminine qualities. I also could consider it as being kind of very maternal, also kind of like fierce. And I don't know, this is the kind of number that you want to have on a team. And it can get like very nuanced like that. People who have these types of associations with numbers can actually struggle with things like arithmetic. And this is something that I struggled with in school, actually. I had a really hard time with arithmetic with something as simple as 2 plus 2, because for most people, 2 plus 2 equals 4 and you move on. But to me, somebody who is fierce and feminine with another person who's fierce and feminine does not equal somebody who is like calm, pacific, and very like friendly. It's just a crowd. So there's an additional layer of having to dissociate or regulate the activity in your brain and kind of parcel it out. Like people who grew up in homes speaking more than one language, these bilingual homes, people used to think it was causing some kind of a delay with language, and it was a disadvantage. And actually, what's been seen in the literature is that people who grew up in bilingual homes actually have an advantage over the long term, where it might take them a little bit longer to speak more fluently in any one language, but they have more kind of experience developing these areas of the brain involved something that's called executive functioning, which is this regulation, basically like track switching between different areas of thinking and being able to regulate themselves. And so it ends up being a benefit. So I think people who are able to dissociate between kind of what they think is going on and what is actually going on are likely to have a leg up when it comes to this executive functioning. And I think in general, it is an advantage because it relates to things like being able to pay attention. It relates to judgment, planning, organization.
Things that everybody would love to have more of.
Yeah, exactly.
Speaking for a friend, one manifestation of this synesthesia is what's called mirror touch synesthesia, which is so fascinating. So if somebody slaps somebody on a wrist, you feel that on your wrist. Is that right? Yeah, this is another form of synesthesia that I have. It's the idea that there are different types of synesthesia is like an artificial kind of like human-made concept, which is, it's mostly for research that we create these categories between the senses, because actually there's just a lot of blending that goes on with these senses all the time anyway in everyone. So it's really just a matter of degrees or where you are on the spectrum of it. And I tend to be kind of objectively on the kind of more extreme end. And this mirror touch experience is taking visual information and potentially other information as well, but it gets translated into the physical, tactile kind of perception parts of the brain as well. I'm just trying to visualize how you get through a day if all these things that are happening around you, somebody falls, somebody gets slapped on the wrist, you're at the doctor's office, you see a needle go in someone's arm. First of all, that's a lot of pain to be feeling. Secondly, it would, to me, feel like a lot of distractions and maybe even premeditated distractions of like worry as you walk into a doctor's office that not only are you going to have to brace for a shot for yourself, but you're going to feel the other shots that you see. In other words, it's just, how does that not take over your mind and make it hard to get through a day?
This goes back to kind of what we were talking about earlier, which is being able to actively unlink pieces of information, knowing that there's a difference between kind of what's going on in the brain and what's going on in the actual world around you, as you can tell. And a lot of it comes down to this executive functioning type of activities going on in the brain, which is being able to focus your attention on very specific areas or specific things going on in the world around you and not being overwhelmed or distracted as best as you can. So here's kind of like a more common example. If you're somebody who likes to drive, and let's say you're driving home on a very familiar route, there are moments, right, where you'll get home and not remember most of the drive. You just don't think about the fact that you're driving. So much of it is already programmed in there.
Right.
For me, some of this sensory information, this added sensory information is like that, where it's always going on in the background, but it's not always at the forefront of my attention. Or
it becomes normalized.
It becomes just like another process, kind of like when you minimize a window on your computer screen.
Right.
It's in the background affecting the processing of the computer. It's just not right there in front of you.
But if somebody gets slapped on the wrist and it's like a hard slap, you feel like a version of it softer, like a touch of it, or you feel like the full slap?
There's a touch of it, and how significant it is depends on a couple of factors. It just has to do with how our brain works and how much it turns the volume up on those things, or whether what I'm seeing triggers that experience before these other areas of my brain get a chance to kick in and dampen it down. And this is all on the order of like milliseconds or nanoseconds. It's like the fraction of a second that this is all going on. And you can only really see it when you're doing these really fancy studies looking at electrical changes in the brain, or do experimental things where you can kind of separate it out. So that way there's like a moment where you can experience the sensory information and not know like where it's really coming from. I think an example of that is going back to the example of grapheme color synesthesia, where I was being studied by some neuroscientists and they had written out the number kind of 3 times in a row. So 2, 2, 2 on a sheet of paper in like a black marker, and they held it in front of me. And he said, all right, what color is the 2 here? And I'd say, yeah, it's this red color with a little bit of violet. And they're like, okay, just call it red. Okay, and now just keep telling us what color it is as we turn this paper kind of clockwise. And I would just say red as they were turning it over, red, continue to turn it over, red. And eventually it just switched to this kind of like reddish, kind of like lightish brown color, like a mahogany. And it caught me off guard, and I was like, oh, weird, why did it change? And then it just took me a few beats to realize, oh, it's because the 2s now look like a capital letter N all the way down. And my brain registered the N and the color for the letter N. So there's so much that's going on below the surface that we are just unaware of, that's influencing how we perceive the world and how we judge the world. And I think if you don't have the patience and the time and the training around being able to be aware of it when it's happening and unlink these spurious kind of brain information and actual real world information out there, it can get you into trouble, I think. And this is a bit of what my colleague Bob Bordone had been working on. Bob Bordone and I have been working on, who was somebody who you interviewed recently. And we've been working on this concept of conflict resilience, and where I come in is really being able to bring in kind of the neuroscience or the brain aspect of this, because I really do think it's a huge part of who we are and what we do and what we think and what we feel. I mean, our brain and our nervous system is the motherboard of reality. And if we don't have a better awareness of what potential tricks our brain can be playing on us, we miss out on a lot of opportunities to really live our best lives, to be our best selves.
Joel, thanks so much for coming on the show and talking about both your work and also your life. There's so much interesting stuff there. Thanks again. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you again. This is a lot of fun.
This conversation with Joel was so interesting. I'm still thinking about this image of a patient who comes into a doctor's office to describe a condition for which there is no easy medical explanation, and how doctors often dismiss that patient's complaints because there's no medical evidence. I really liked how Joel pointed out that doctor doesn't have to focus on what's not there. He or she can also decide to focus on what is there, at least for the patient. In other words, they can validate that patient's feelings and their reality of not feeling well. This is such a good communications lesson. It's all about connecting with people because you're really listening to them on a deep level, or what Joelle refers to as active listening. It's something all of us should aim for in our interactions with other people. Hey, if you've got a cool communications experience that had a big impact on you, email me. I'd love to feature you on the show. Also, like and subscribe to You Said What if you get a chance. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week.